Thank you very much for the three speakers. I think that we will have a very, I would say, intense conversation, and also you can start. So please, comments or questions, but short. Yes, Renato Moro. To all the three.
About George Mosse's idea of brutalization. I probably am wrong, but my memory of many readings of foreign sources tells that, according to Mosse, brutalization was not of the whole European society, but of politics. Yeah. That is, of course, Mosse admitted that mass killing during the First World War influenced and diminished reactions against mass murder. But the main point was brutalization of politics. So, in this sense, my question is, don't you think that what you said about militarism and fascism is really not in contradiction, but a consequence of this view that is militarizing politics is one of the main features of fascism?
I waited because I'm picking up Paul, Marianne, and Atina. And the second term.
Yeah.
So,
thanks very much for a really great panel.
Paul, can you stand up?
Yes, I will.
So
Thanks very much for a great panel and really great comments. My question came when I was listening to Annette, and I was struck by the fact that of all the things that you covered with all those wonderful images, you didn't say very much about the Bolshevik Revolution. Omer did. And I'm curious where you would put that in your understanding of the war. I think we can resist Ernst Nolte and not go down into the historical stride and still say that anti-communism was incredibly centered politically, ideologically, symbolically of all kinds of right-wing politics, fascist adjacent, fascistic, however you want to call it. And so I'm just curious where we stick that now in our review of the war.
Can you stand up and speak louder?
Yes. So I'm not very comfortable with analysis of Professor Bartov. And I will have only one question, which is, do you think there is a difference between the way in which fascists conduct the war and other countries, democratic countries? Because at the end, what is the difference between colonial war, between genocide, non-genocide? I'm sorry for my English, but I think we have I don't see the complexity in your analysis. I'm sorry, je ne sais pas si vous comprenez le français, du coup mon anglais m'amène à caricaturer un peu ce que je voudrais dire, mais j'ai le sentiment que, bon, à la fin, on est historien pour établir des nuances, et là on a l'impression que tout est en tout, qu'il y a une espèce d'immense continuité dans l'histoire de la violence. Or, je regrette, même si à la fin des morts sont des morts, les processus ne sont pas les mêmes et les mots ont une utilité.
Thank you. Atina?
Okay, I'm trying to look at my computer. So let me see. I just wanted to sort of press on this point that Omer brought up about, what the meaning of the term, innocence, and where and when we lost it, and the slippage, I think, between thinking about World War I as the moment of the loss of innocence for Europe, and then actually, Annette, you sort of went back and forth, but you said in the paper, you said that the world would come to mourn the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, and the loss of an innocence never to be regained. And there it was, the world. And of course, I think those of us who teach students, right, and, you know, who are mostly come from non-European backgrounds, I mean, we immediately get that response, which is the one that Omer enunciated, of what are you talking about? You know, I mean, we who grew up in the shadow of the Middle Passage, and I mean, I don't need to go through the list, but it does feel like that is sort of a key point that we have to really press and analyze, and that sort of leads me to thinking about some of the issues that came up yesterday already in the panel on empire, and will come up, I think, again in the next panel, about, you know, how would this workshop, this conference, be different if indeed we had, and maybe we do it the next time, maybe this is for the concluding discussion, but, you know, if we really thought about, you know, what does it mean to decolonize fascism? Okay. What would it mean to bring in fascism studies, to bring in people, you know, to bring in scholars from, yes, the global south, who would think very differently about the meaning of der Zivilisationsbruch, right? A sort of, you know, fundamental break. Or, yes.
Thank you. So we'll start Sven with Renato, Paul, please, with Annette. Okay.
It is a little bit more ambivalent, I would say, but of course you're right. Mosse is talking about the brutalization of politics and how a cultural pattern has changed a discourse to talk about politics. And this is very true, and I don't disagree with that. But he mentions the word, let's say, they don't find back into the private or civilian life, the desperados, the fascist desperados. There is also this biographical, dimension in his text, and in so far, I would say, in contrast to what was known in the 1970s, we know from social history since the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, that more than 50% of the squadristi were not fighting as soldiers in the First World War. There were the younger brothers. There is a cultural and maybe also a family relationship to the war, but not this direct way. And of course, you have to overview these peaceful soldiers, which said, "I will never go back to war, and I learned my lesson." And sometimes they forgot this peaceful soldiers and the influence they had on the interwar years. So far, street politics and fighters are part of politics as well. And so far, I would say it is partly in contradiction with what he said, but not.
Annette, Paul.
I entered the three together because I think they fit together. Coming to Mosse, I totally agree with you. But at the end of his life, I was a very good friend of him. And we were very often speaking about the statistics of soldiers coming back, beating their wife, the rate of divorces, where it was possible, and all this kind of thing. The intimate story of every man was the fact that everybody has been brutalized. So he wrote about politics. I totally agree, and I agree with what Sven just answered. But you have to bring the intimacy, the gender, which was not his time. He is a politician. He is a historian of politics, actually, and it's not our kind of history. But he would agree with it at the end of his life. And coming to the Bolshevik Revolution is something like that. Because the Bolshevik stole their own revolution, so they forgot about their war. And you have to wait for the last 5 years to have real great history of the price paid by the Russian population to the First World War. Immense. The invalids, by example, it was a huge burden on the new Soviet state to have all these invalids to take care about, by example. But in their political ways, and that's why I'm totally agree with Grossman. I'm very happy you quoted Grossman. It was so similar. It was about politics, their thing. And the other picked only politics. And that's why the Bolshevik Revolution was used as a political tool for them, in their sense, and for the other, the fascist or not fascist, in their sense. And it makes completely sense, because they did not want to see what was really the First World War, especially on the Russian territories. I will take the example of prisoners, which was absolutely huge. And to finish, to answer to Atina, I am adamant about the word, because when you think about colonies, if you say the awful French and the awful British, they were treating them badly. No, they have agentivity. As Omer said, they wanted something new. They wanted their liberty. Ho Chi Minh, who was a poor laborer at the time, came to Versailles and said, we want to be free. And Ho Chi Minh saw that after a long time, after the Second World War. But it was part of the thing. So it is really a world event, and a world event where everybody understood that. The poor laborer was Ho Chi Minh couldn't understand that. But at the same time, there was something different. There was consent. And when you speak about the father of Camus, the Algerians the French in Algeria, the colons, like the father of Camus, they were so happy to fight for their motherland. The Australian, they did the 20,000 kilometers around the world to come and fight in Europe. And all this, they regretted. And after that, they had lost their innocence, and they were ready for peace. But all things that you said very well stopped the peace. But the innocence was finished, definitely.
Okay.
So, 3 points. One on those who were the political soldiers of Nazism or fascism, and many of whom did not serve in the war. I mean, I think we have to remember what it meant to be a young lad growing up in wartime. 4 years, 6 years, depending where. I published a diary of a Polish school teacher from World War I, and he talks about what 6 years of fighting on the Eastern Front did to the children, how it brutalized them. And so, yes, many of them did not serve in the war. Some of them, as Robert Wall writes, the fact that they never quite made it they were preparing to go to war and that the war ended on them already created a particular mentality, but also the fact that the war itself, the events of the war had a huge brutalizing effect on society that most of us, have not lived in wartime. We don't know what it feels like, and we tend to think that there were those who were fighting and those who were not. And those were wars in which there was a much closer, as Annette was saying, as Sven was saying, the connection between the home front and the front was very close. So I would say that as one comment. The second on, so how do you make distinctions? What is colonial war? What is total war? What is fascist war? What is genocide? It all seems like it's all the same, right? War is terrible. Now, so I certainly don't support that view that war is terrible. There are wars and there are wars. The German army in World War II fought totally different wars in different places. The same army, the same soldiers, fought a different war on the Eastern Front where they were massacring vast numbers of civilians, prisoners of war, and in France, where they were conducting a pretty civilized war. Prisoners of war under German, under the Wehrmacht, taken by the Wehrmacht, Western prisoners of war had a very, very, very low rate of death. Normal rate of death, just as if they were not prisoners of war. And Soviet prisoners had 60% rate. So yes, there are different wars, but you need to see a trajectory. And there is a trajectory. You need to know, how do you get from one place to another? How does that happen? And you can't start by saying, okay, there was fascism, and then fascism did horrible things. Where did it come from? Where were these mechanisms created? So there's all kinds of ways of thinking about it. Was it that the German army, when it was sent in 1914 to fight against the Herero, just came and said, if, you know, we are going to destroy you. They issue a Vernichtungsbefehl. There was no such thing in Europe at the time, but once you invent this idea, you may import it back into Europe, right? So there are mechanisms of change over time. And you can see that happening in various armies, and you can see it happening from one war to the other. I would say that World War I creates a particular view of how you can use vast numbers of soldiers, and as I said before, as Menschenmaterial, you think of, you have 10,000 soldiers here, 100,000 soldiers there, you can send them to die. That creates a particular way of thinking. It creates an administrative way of thinking. It creates a bureaucracy that can then be twisted into one that does not apply to soldiers, but applies to civilians, particularly civilians that you decide for other reasons have to be eliminated. And in genocide, in modern genocide, this is precisely what you see. You see genocide is always carried out as a war. Everybody wears uniforms. Everybody has a hierarchy. Everybody thinks that they are actually doing a military thing, even though there's no danger for them. They're safe. Now, on the last thing, on innocence, what Tina was asking, I would, or saying, I would say, yes, of course, innocence depends on the eyes of the beholder. But it's not even that Europe was innocent. Of course it wasn't innocent. It was either ignorant or denying. This is what Heart of Darkness is about. It doesn't want to talk about it. And the peculiar thing is that until today, often it doesn't want to talk about it. After it's all over, after all those millions of people, say, under King Leopold's Congo, up to 10 million people died in that empire, people don't talk about it as if it didn't happen. And when you try to see the trajectory from then to now, the fact that we can talk about fascism as completely unconnected to the kind of words of slavery, exploitation, and genocide, as if they happen in another universe, that's another discipline. We don't talk about it, let them talk about it. That to me seems a very strange way of doing history in the 21st century.
Thank you. So the last 4 questions, and I really don't want to comment. Seriously. Questions, and so they have to speak. Okay, so Ofer, Anke, and Mark, and you. You in particular, because yesterday you spoke for something for like 10 minutes. I remember. Sorry to say that. Okay, Ofer.
Okay, I'll be brief. An innocent question. Just to complicate the connection between fascism and war a little bit. When the Nazis gained political power, this is a time where there is a strong public sentiment in Germany against the war. It's very strong. It seems like, you know, the pacifists say we won the war. And after 1933, there are some very ardent Nazis that believe that, you know, the militarism is part of the rhetoric, but it doesn't have to be about war. And there are some organizations, Nazi-backed organizations, that see themselves as anti-war organizations and talk with British and American activists and so forth. And we all know the propaganda about Hitler gains everything without a single shot and so on and so forth. I know. My question is, how do we introduce that into the narrative? Can we imagine some kind of fascism, some kind of Nazism that doesn't go to war?
So please, Anke, Mark, and the gentleman with the white jacket.
Just one observation question about this notion of brutalization. Historians who have dealt with who have tested this thesis empirically agree that it doesn't work. So it is to exaggerated connection apart from the Great War to totalitarianism or the Holocaust. And in fact, Mosse introduced that notion in his book, but that came from an article that was rejected by peer review in a journal. You can look at it in Mosse's papers. But, however, in that book, in Fallen Soldier, there's a much useful concept. Don't you think that this concept, also by Mosse, of the myth of the war experience helps us to explain these processes much better than brutalization?
Mark, and then...
Mine's a comment. I'm going to cede my time to the honourable member in the white jacket.
Thanks. All right, so I thought it was fantastic. I think, again, because as Professor Bartov said, it points us back to the conditions of fascism. I want to second his recommendation, too, of the definition of Michael Howard of fascism, which is as something that resides deep in the hearts and minds of men, something that we're born with, we have to be educated out of. And so that's my question here, is if we can reduce war in general, the First World War in particular, and in turn fascism, to a crisis of bourgeois masculinity. I'm done.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to...
Well, I was
Yes, please.
Yes, okay, thanks. I very much enjoyed the tension that emerged between as whether or not we're talking about the war as a generative force or as something that calls out for stories in the post-war period as the powerful refractive force. So where we're laying the emphasis on the power of interpretation, the politics of the post, or whether we're laying it on the raw facts which are generating history in the war. So I thought was excellent and remains as a tension. My worry is, it refers to sort of Omar's and Tina's comment, that in every age there's something which we're very differentiated about, and there's something which we're kind of morally simplistic about. And I worry that the colonialism and the colonial past and decolonization is the thing that we're being simplistic about. And I feel like yesterday's Imperial panel made us think about how different empire is done and how different colonial relationships are. And I worry that we risk creating a new flattening story if we have the colonial as the simple sort of evil start in this, and the war is refracting that. I think if we're going to bring in colonial past, which I think we should, then we have to be as careful and as differentiated about that experience and that refraction as we are being about the war and its relation to the post-war period. So that's it.
Annette, Sven, and Omer, 5 minutes, then we'll address the fourth question.
I answer Mark first, because I cannot agree more. We saw it yesterday already, but it is obvious. The colonies were so different. The way the colonialist powers were treating the population were so different that just to put the colonies all together and to say what happened with the Herero is a root for the Holocaust, because also Göring's father was there, I think it's a pure idiocy that my dear German colleagues invented in the last 20 years. So I cannot agree more. I don't want to say more about that. But we have to be careful that we are historians or anthropologists or sociologists. And there are things, there are documents, there are facts. We cannot just do beautiful theories which have nothing to do with what happened on the ground during or after the war. And thank you to remind that to us now about colonies, but it's true about everything. For the myth about the myth of war experience, I totally agree with you. Actually, it is in my written paper, but as you saw, I skipped a lot. And I think it's a very fertile thing that George did. And that's why he was, I said he was an historian of politics, but he was also an historian of culture and thinking. And this idea of the myth, it is something that definitely is very important. He has been working a lot about Langemarck, by example, and this now the new historian of Nazism go back to that to understand what was behind it. And to finish the answer about author question. Sorry. I think that to understand who wanted war or not, you have to see that after the First World War, the one who won the war were exhausted. And if they accepted so many things from Hitler, and the German and the Italians before, and if they didn't take any Jews as refugees, it was for the same reason. They didn't want to have any more problems. They wanted to stop that. And all were veterans of the First World War. I agree with you, the youngsters were not at the front, but all the officers and all the politicians had been veterans. And so these veterans had seen the catastrophe of the First World War, and this is something they did not want. And if Germany could be so good at war, it's because they lost the war. And when you, because of the losing of the war, first you are totally out, and most Germans were pacifists. And to my knowledge, it is with a strange defeat, my hero being Mark Bloch. It is after the strange defeat that the Germans changed their mind. Not after Poland, after France. They won France, so they could go on with war. And it is where they finished to be pacifist. So it has to do and not to do with the First World War.
Okay, two remarks. The first is, once again, on this biographical question. I mean, of course, you're right. There is a biographical dimension. The heroism taught at the schools. They read newspapers. They play the war. They play battles, and so on and so forth. They were influenced as kids during the war. But you miss an important point. If you think they are traumatized during the war, they reinvented the war after the war. And this is an important process. I mean, if you talk about the SA, this is in the early 30s, and 90% of them were younger than 1902, and they reinvented, and the myth of the fallen soldiers, they think about themselves. We are the new fighters. We are fighting for the First World War has not ended. We are fighting for it. So on this kind of reinvention and this cultural dimension, you miss if you only think about the biographical dimension. The other thing is, as far as colonization is concerned, I would say one important or interesting point in this respect could be that the ratio, for example, I mentioned, is this large-scale raids of the National Socialists in 1933 and 34. You will understand if you look how they invented the razzia, and this was important that they looked at what has happened in Algeria. around 1900, and they learned from it the asocials, the homosexuals, the prostitutes, publicly propagated as security risks, and that they learned the SS, the police officers, from the colonial situation, and made it police repression could be understood in this colonial sense. That's asocial behavior, cleansing the streets, as Goering put it, in the Bagger riots in September 33, and so on. The early razzia in the National Socialist regime can be understood as somehow as a colonial part or a background, let's say.
Totally agree with Sven. So there is a biographical dimension, but there's also a subsequent dimension, clearly. Part of it is the notion of the Fundgemeinschaft, this notion that we were once in a different world where people, not us, but our fathers or uncles, had been in that reality where they saw the world through different eyes, where it was the real life. And that obviously translates, not with the majority, but it translates with large numbers of young men into thinking themselves into now fighting the political battle to regain what was lost in World War I and in the peace. So obviously I completely agree with that. I want to touch just on, look, I mean, there are two somewhat ironic things here. We may end up this panel saying that all the Germans were pacifists, and that Nazism could have been fine without going to war. All right, but Nazism did go to war and did destroy Europe and killed millions of people. So how did we get from one place to another is something we need to explain. I don't know that we've explained it here, but I think it needs to be explained. One is that there were people living in 1935, 1936 Germany, and they were very happy. The economy was getting better. The Wehrmacht was being recreated. Germany was great again. It was good on the world map. And all the elements that many people didn't really like were gone, right? Roma, Sinti, Jews, handicapped, they were all sort of being put away. So it was great for most Germans, right? But was that all? No, because Nazism from the very beginning had a particular rhetoric. You cannot imagine, I cannot imagine, I think we would be wrong to imagine Nazism not being geared toward war. This was at the core of what Hitler spoke about, at the core of what the people around him spoke about. This is how he revived the Wehrmacht. This were the people that he put together there. They were looking to refight the war and win it. Now, did most Germans want it or not? Well, it's a bit hard to say, really. That's the truth. We don't exactly know. We can assume, but there were no elections in 36 or 37. So we don't know exactly. And yes, in 1940, everybody was very happy. In June 1940, Hitler, had he gone for elections, would have won in a landslide, right? And in 43, they were much less happy, obviously, because so many people had died. But to think of Nazism as not being geared toward war and destruction is to create something that didn't exist.
Thank you very much.